Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name that makes planetary governors sweat through their fine silks in the dead of night. A name that causes high-ranking generals to lose their voices mid-sentence. A name spoken in whispers across the billion worlds of the Imperium of man, usually only once, and always with a particular kind of weight behind it. The weight of something very heavy being lowered into dark, still water. That name is the Inquisition, the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, agents of absolute authority, answerable to no one save the Emperor himself. Men and women who carry the inquisitorial rosette, a small seal of office that grants them power so sweeping that even the mightiest high lords of terror are compelled to comply with their demands without question. They can commandeer warships, requisition entire armies, or order the execution of planetary governors on the spot. They can walk into any room, in any building, on any world in the Imperium, and every single occupant will feel the air change the moment they cross the threshold. And at the very extreme end of their authority, they can have a world destroyed, every city flattened, every ocean boiled away, every last living person on that world, from the poorest underhive worker to the highest-born noble, wiped from existence. All of it burned to sterile, airless rock in a process called exterminatus, which is perhaps the most honest name any military procedure in the history of human warfare has ever been given. So when we talk about fear in the context of the Inquisition, the natural instinct is to look at it from the obvious direction, as to examine the fear that ordinary imperial citizens feel when they hear that word. That very particular cold dread that settles in the gut when a black ship descends through the clouds and figures in dark robes step out onto the landing pad with faces like frozen stone and eyes that have seen things no one in the crowd around them can imagine. That fear is real, it is earned, and it is entirely reasonable. But that's not what we're exploring today. Today we're going to flip it. We're going to look at it from the other side of the mirror, from inside the organization itself, and ask a question that doesn't get asked nearly often enough. A question that, when you turn it over and examine its implications slowly, produces something genuinely worth sitting with. What is the Inquisition afraid of? Because here's the thing about these people. These extraordinary, exhausted, brilliant, often half-mad people who choose this life, who walked willingly into the darkest rooms the galaxy has to offer, and who kept walking. They read forbidden texts that would break an ordinary person in 3 paragraphs. They stare at things that once seen cannot be unseen. They make decisions that doom entire worlds, that consign hundreds of millions of innocent people to death in the cause of preserving something larger. And then they get up the next morning and make another decision, and another, and another, carrying the weight of every previous one forward. And beneath all of that relentless, iron-jawed, forward-facing purpose, there are things that genuinely frighten them. Not in the flinching, theatrical way that children are afraid of the dark. In the deeper, as quieter way that only people who truly understand a danger can be afraid of it. The kind of fear that doesn't make you freeze in place or dissolve into panic. The kind that makes you sharper, colder, more efficient, more willing to do things that would horrify any reasonable observer because you have done the math on what happens if you don't. We're going to go through the things that keep inquisitors awake, the threats, the secrets, the forces, and the uncomfortable truths that they spend every waking hour trying to hold at bay, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. We'll look at what they fear from outside the Imperium, and what they fear from within it. We'll look at what they fear they might become, and what they fear the Imperium itself might already have become. And by the end of it, what you might find that you have a very different relationship with what it means to call the Inquisition scary. Because the scariest thing about the Inquisition might just be what scares them. Let's begin. Part 1. The ocean beneath reality. The warp itself. If you want to understand what the Inquisition fears, there is one place you must start. one foundation beneath all the other fears on this list, one source from which most of the horrors in this setting ultimately flow. And that is the warp, called the Imperium by scholars, the Immersive by the learned, the Sea of Souls by those who have spent enough time in proximity to it that they've stopped trying to maintain the pretense of clinical distance. On the most practical level, the warp is what makes the Imperium of man possible. Yeah, it is an alternate dimension of pure psychic energy that underlies the physical universe, the way the deep roots of a tree underlie everything visible above ground. The physical laws that govern the universe, the speed of light, the constraints of space and time, do not apply in the warp the same way. Distances that would take generations to cross at conventional speed can be traversed in weeks or months by a ship plunging into the warp and riding its currents. This is how a human empire spanning 1 million worlds across the galaxy can exist and maintain any coherence at all. Without warp travel, it couldn't. The Imperium would be a collection of isolated worlds, each separated from its neighbors by centuries of journey time, unable to communicate, unable to support each other, unable to function as anything but the scattered remnants of a species that once thought it had a future. The Astronomicon, a psychic lighthouse blazing from terror, powered by the continuous sacrifice of roughly 1,000 psykers every single day, their souls and life energies spent to maintain the beacon, provides a fixed reference point in the warp that allows the navigators aboard Imperial vessels to steer their ships through that howling, unpredictable dimension and arrive somewhere approximating where they intended to go. So the warp is essential, non-negotiable. The Imperium literally cannot exist without it, which makes it uniquely, catastrophically dangerous, because the warp is not empty. Let's try to describe what it actually is, because this is important and often glossed over. Imagine that every living being that has ever existed in the galaxy, every human, every Aeldari, every creature that ever had an inner life, an emotion, a desire. Imagine that every feeling any of them ever had left a residue, an echo, a trace of psychic energy bleeding from the physical universe into this adjacent dimension. Imagine that process happening across billions of years, across millions of species, across civilizations rising and falling and rising again, wars and loves and births and deaths beyond counting. All of that emotional and psychic residue pooling in the warp, building up over geological ages, accumulating depth and complexity, beginning to form patterns, shapes, something approaching personality, something approaching will. This is where the Chaos Gods came from. They are not invaders from outside the universe. They are not ancient beings from some other creation who entered this one. They are made of us, made from the cumulative psychic output of every living being that ever felt anything, concentrated and shaped into entities of divine and terrible power by the mechanisms of a dimension that runs on emotion and belief. Horn crystallized from the collective weight of rage, hatred, aggression, from every battle ever fought, every life ever taken in anger, every capacity for violence that mortal beings have ever expressed. Nurgle grew from despair, from the fear of decay and death, from the strange peace that comes with accepting that everything decays eventually, from the love that people express by clinging to what is rotting, because it was once something they valued. He is, in a strange way, the most intimate of the Chaos Gods. As because every mortal being who has ever feared illness or watched someone they love decline has fed him something. Tzeentch emerged from hope, from ambition, from the desire for change, from the irrepressible urge to plan and scheme and imagine better futures, and then twist those imagined futures into something unrecognizable through the sheer complexity of pursuing them. He is the god of those who reach for more than they have, which means he has an enormous constituency. And Slaanesh, the youngest, the most recent, the one whose birth caused the single largest catastrophic event in the galaxy's recent history. Slaanesh was created from excess, from sensation and desire pushed past every limit. The fall of the Aeldari, It's an ancient and immensely psychically powerful species whose civilization peaked millions of years ago and whose internal decadence in that peak generated, over thousands of years, the psychic mass of a new deity, was the birth of Slaanesh. When Slaanesh was born, it consumed most of the Eldari in an instant. Their souls pulled across the dimensional boundary and devoured. What remained of the Eldari, the Craftworld survivors, the Exodites who had fled, the Harlequins, the Drukhari in their hidden city, are the remnants of a species that gave birth to a god by accident and nearly ceased to exist in the same moment. The Eye of Terror, the massive stable warp rift that dominates a region near the galactic core, is the scar left by Slaanesh's birth. It is where the barrier between the warp and real space is permanently thin and in places non-existent. It is where the traitor legions that fled the Imperium after the Horus heresy retreated to. It is, in many ways, the single most dangerous location in the galaxy, and the Imperium spent thousands of years maintaining a fortress world called Cadia at its edge specifically to prevent what eventually happened, which was that it fell. The Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus understand all of this with a clarity that most humans in the Imperium do not, cannot, and, by deliberate inquisitorial policy, will not be permitted to develop. They understand it because their job requires it. And understanding it fully is one of the psychological costs of the posting. Because understanding the warp fully means understanding its scale, its age, as its relationship to everything mortal beings feel and do, and the extent to which it is not a problem that can be solved. The warp existed before the Imperium. It will exist after. The Chaos Gods, fed by the constant emotional output of billions of living beings across the galaxy, are not going to diminish unless the galaxy itself diminishes. They are not going to become more manageable as time passes. The situation is not getting better. The specific fear that the warp generates in the Inquisition is not fear of any particular manifestation. It is the systemic fear, the background radiation fear, the fear of an ocean that you are navigating in a boat that you know is not fully seaworthy, in waters that are not calm and not getting calmer, with the knowledge that if you stop paddling for even a moment, yet the current will pull you in a direction that is very bad. The warp is always there. It underlies everything. Every psyker is a potential crack in the hull. Every chaos cult is a deliberate attempt to punch a hole in the bottom of the boat. Every demon incursion is water that got in anyway and is now your immediate problem, and also everyone else's problem, whether they know it or not. And the Inquisition is the crew, trying to bail, trying to patch the cracks, trying to maintain heading, and fully aware that they are doing this in an ocean that has no shores and no calm seasons. The warp destabilizes when the emotional state of the mortal universe intensifies. War, and the 41st millennium is defined by constant war on thousands of fronts simultaneously, feeds the warp. Every death on a battlefield, every atrocity committed in a hive city, every terror and despair and rage that a human being expresses bleeds through into the warp and makes it more turbulent, more hostile, more likely to produce the phenomena that the Inquisition exists to contain. This is the most fundamentally hopeless aspect of the situation. The Inquisition is fighting a war to contain the effects of warfare, and fighting the war to contain those effects generates more of the thing they're trying to contain. In the final years of the 41st millennium, the setting that current Warhammer 40,000 lore occupies, a wound was torn across the galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift. A catastrophic breach in the dimensional membrane stretching roughly halfway across the Milky Way, bleeding warp energy into real space, cutting the Imperium in two, were bathing the night sky across countless worlds in the unnatural, shifting light of the exposed immaterium. What had once been isolated warp storms and localized incursions became, in the wake of the Great Rift's opening, the baseline condition of enormous stretches of imperial space. The Inquisition had been afraid of this for a long time. That it happened anyway is simply a measure of the gap between the Inquisition's capabilities and the scale of the forces it was trying to hold. Part 2. The truth that must never be known. Chaos and the demonic secret. We go deeper now. We go into the specific fear that the warp produces, the most operationally demanding and psychologically costly aspect of the Inquisition's entire mandate. Demons, the Ordo Malleus, the Order of the Hammer, the Demon Hunters, exists for one primary purpose, yet to deal with the entities that cross over from the warp into the physical universe, to face demons directly, to drive them back, to close the rifts through which they enter, to eliminate the mortals who summoned or enabled them, and to ensure that as little as possible of what happened reaches public awareness afterward. To understand what makes this so demanding, you have to understand what a demon actually is on a fundamental level. A demon is not a monster, not in the way that the word is usually used. It is not simply something large and dangerous with bad intentions. A demon is a fragment of a chaos god, a piece of divine, malevolent psychic given form by the stuff of the Imperium. It exists at the intersection of belief, emotion, and raw warp energy. It is not entirely physical. It is not entirely real in the way that solid objects are real. It is held in the material universe by the resonance of whatever emotion it embodies. And if that resonance fails, if the conditions that allow it to remain in real space change, it will dissolve back into the warp. But dissolving back into the warp is not death. It is retreat. Given enough time, given the right conditions, it will reconstitute. The demon primarchs who fought at the Siege of Terror, beings of almost inconceivable power, the corrupted sons of the Emperor himself, were not destroyed in that battle. They retreated into the Eye of Terror and have been there ever since, enduring, growing in the warp's timeless depths, occasionally manifesting to cause catastrophic damage before retreating again. Killing a demon permanently requires very specific conditions. Weapons suffused with psychic energy of the right kind, directed through the right rituals, delivered with precision. The Grey Knights, the Space Marine chapter that serves as the Ordo Malleus's chamber militant, whose existence is one of the most classified facts in the entire Imperium, are specifically built and trained for this task. Every Grey Knight is a psyker. Every one of them has been subjected to training and conditioning so extreme that it would kill any ordinary person several times over. Their armor is inscribed with prayers and protections against demonic influence. Their weapons are warp-attuned. They are, in a very real sense, the Imperium's response to the question, what kind of soldier do you need to reliably fight something that isn't entirely material? The answer was, apparently, this kind, and it costs this much to produce them, and there are never enough. But the most significant aspect of the Ordo Malleus's fear around demons is not the entities themselves. It is not the terror they produce in proximity, though that is real and should not be minimized. Trained Space Marines have been reduced to screaming by sustained exposure to certain greater demons, not through physical damage, but through the psychic pressure of the demon's mere presence. That aspect of demon combat is its own horror. The deepest fear is the information problem. The Inquisition has maintained, as fundamental policy since its founding in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, that the existence of chaos, the genuine, specific knowledge of what the chaos gods are, what the warp contains, what the nature of demonic entities actually is, must be kept from the general imperial population. Not because the Inquisition is being elitist about who deserves to know, though that is sometimes a secondary justification. Because knowledge of chaos is itself a vector of corruption. This is a claim that sounds like superstition until you understand the mechanism. The warp responds to belief, attention, emotional investment. The chaos gods are fed by the feelings of living beings. To know that Tzeentch exists and is listening, to understand what Nurgle represents and to feel fear or despair in connection with that understanding, to name Khorne with genuine comprehension of what that name means. These are not neutral cognitive acts. They are, however slightly, forms of contact. They open, however fractionally, channels between the mortal mind and the warp. The Emperor himself, during the Great Crusade, did not tell his Primarchs the full truth of what lived in the warp. The most powerful human being who ever existed, the being who could navigate the raw immaterium directly, who could destroy demons with a gesture, who understood the nature of chaos at a level beyond any other mortal, decided that even his genetically engineered superhuman sons were not safe to carry that knowledge. He feared, correctly as events proved, that for many of them, the knowledge alone would begin the process of corruption. The Inquisition inherited this policy and has upheld it for 10,000 years with extreme consistency. The survivors of demonic incursions are mind-wiped, not because the Inquisition is callous, though it sometimes is, but because the knowledge those people now carry, the genuine, first-hand knowledge of what demons look like and what they do and how they speak, is classified as a biohazard. It is a contamination of a very specific kind. This creates, in practice, an enormous operational burden. Because demons, when they manifest, do not manifest quietly or invisibly. A mid-scale demonic incursion on an inhabited world can be witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. Cities might be partially consumed. Structures might transform. People might be possessed in ways that are visually dramatic and very difficult to interpret as anything other than what they are. By the time the incursion is contained, there is a large population of witnesses who now know something they were never supposed to know. Every single one of those witnesses is now, by inquisitorial protocol, a problem that must be managed. The aftermath of the First War for Armageddon is the most famous and disturbing example of what this management looks like in practice. Armageddon, a strategically vital hive world, home to billions, was invaded by the forces of the demon Primarch Angron, whose physical manifestation is one of the most overwhelming things that can happen in real space. Angron is a being of such concentrated warp energy and physical power that just fighting in his proximity distorts the minds of those around him. The war was brutal, extensive, and ultimately won by the defenders. Angron was banished back to the warp. Then came the quiet work. The Armageddon containment protocol was initiated. The surviving population, soldiers who had fought honorably and bravely, civilians who had endured an invasion that shouldn't have been possible, defense force members who had given everything they had, were classified as contaminated information vectors. The entire surviving population of billions was to be subject to screening, quarantine, and dispersal. The soldiers, whose testimony was especially detailed and credible, were to be taken from their homes, separated from each other to prevent the comparison of accounts, and scattered to labor camps across the galaxy so that the knowledge they carried couldn't crystallize into anything coherent. The Space Wolves chapter had fought alongside the Armageddon defenders. When they understood what was being proposed for people who had just fought and bled and died as loyal servants of the Emperor, they refused, flatly, loudly, with the specific anger of warriors who have a very particular philosophy about the relationship between loyalty and reward. What followed, the months of shame, was as close as the Imperium has come to internal civil war between the Inquisition and the Adeptus Astartes in the post-heresy era. Worlds were subjected to exterminatus because refugee ships from Armageddon had briefly docked there to take on supplies. The Inquisitor prosecuting the containment ranged across multiple sectors, destroying anything that had come into contact with Armageddon survivors, on the grounds that the information had spread too far to be contained any other way. Consider that for a moment. Worlds destroyed, populations ended, not because those populations had been corrupted or had done anything wrong. Because they were in the same location as people who knew something the Inquisition had decided the galaxy couldn't afford to have known. This is the cost of the demonic secret. This is why the Ordo Malleus occupies its particular psychological territory, because they are not just fighting demons, they are also managing the consequences of demons having been fought. They are cleaning up after a reality that keeps refusing to stay contained. And every time a containment fails, every time information slips through, every time a witness escapes, every time a mind wipe doesn't take completely, the calculation has to be made again about what that failure requires in response. The psychological weight of this on individual inquisitors is difficult to fully articulate. The Ordo Malleus attracts, broadly speaking, two types of person. At those whose faith is so absolute and so structured that the weight doesn't crack it, who operate from a position of certainty so deep that even confronting the genuine horror of the demonic doesn't shake the foundation, and those whose exposure to the truth of the warp has produced something different, something harder to name, but evident in the way they move through the world, a kind of permanent, quiet urgency, the urgency of someone who knows exactly what they're holding back and exactly how bad it would be if they stopped. Neither type sleeps well. Part 3. The mind's waking up. The psyche rising. Now, let's look at something that produces a different quality of fear. Not the dramatic, immediate threat of a demonic incursion, but something slower, more diffuse, and in certain ways harder to address. But the human population is changing. Across centuries and millennia, generation by generation, an increasing proportion of humans are being born with the potential for psychic ability, the potential to interface, consciously or unconsciously, with the warp, to draw energy from that dimension and express it as power in the physical world, as precognition, as telepathy, as the ability to hurl bolts of psychic force or heal wounds or sense the emotional state of everyone in a room without being told. These people are called psychers, and they represent, simultaneously, the most useful and the most dangerous category of human being in the galaxy. To understand the Inquisition's complicated, anxious relationship with psychers, you have to understand what happens when a psycher's abilities manifest without training, without guidance, and without the psychic shielding that proper instruction provides. The warp is not a passive backdrop. It is inhabited, densely, by entities that have been described in various ways across different cultures and traditions. Spirits, demons, angels, gods, nightmares, but which the Inquisition's more clinical framework simply calls warp entities or demons, depending on their scale and coherence. These entities are drawn to psychic activity, the way certain deep-sea organisms are drawn to bioluminescence in the dark. They can sense a psyche reaching into the warp. They interpret that reaching as an opening, an invitation, a crack in the boundary that separates real space from the immaterium. An untrained psyche who begins to manifest strong abilities is a door with a compromised lock in an area that has been historically very dangerous after dark. The door might hold for a while, it might hold for years, but every time the psyche uses their abilities without the mental discipline to control the interface, every time they are overwhelmed by emotion and their barriers drop, every time they sleep without the meditative practice that keeps the door properly shut, something on the other side will push at it. And sometimes something will get through. The results of this vary enormously, depending on the psyche's natural resilience, the strength of the entity attempting entry, and the local psychic conditions of the area. Sometimes the manifestation is subtle and slow, voices that aren't there. These dreams full of imagery that the dreamer knows somehow didn't originate in their own mind. Small, unexplained events in the psyche's vicinity. Personality shifts that concern the people around them, but which no single incident makes definitively alarming. The drift towards something that isn't the person who used to be there. Sometimes the manifestation is sudden, catastrophic, and public in the worst possible way. A psyche under emotional crisis, or one whose abilities have reached a critical threshold their mental defenses can no longer hold, can become the epicenter of a spontaneous warp event, reality tearing around them, the psychic barrier shredding, demons flooding through in numbers proportional to the size of the breach, which can be large enough and enduring enough to consume an entire city before it collapses. These events are called psychic hemorrhages, or warp bleeds, or in local parlance on the worlds where they happen, the kinds of things people name after what they felt like from the inside. They are not rare. They are not theoretical worst-case scenarios that the Inquisition keeps in the planning documents to justify budget allocations. They happen. They have been happening throughout the Imperium's history, and they are happening more frequently as the proportion of psykers in the human population increases. On a single world, with a capable inquisitorial presence and rapid response, this is a problem that can be managed. Across 1 million worlds, with the rate of psyker births accelerating generation by generation, us with the Inquisition stretched impossibly thin and the black ships running circuits that cover only a fraction of the worlds that need to be covered, it is a slow-motion catastrophe that the Inquisition has been trying to get ahead of for thousands of years, and is, by most honest internal assessments, not quite managing. The black ships are the Inquisition's primary infrastructure for handling this. They are exactly what they sound like. Dark, heavy vessels, frequently old and scarred, that travel regular routes through Imperial space and stop at each world to collect the psykers that have been identified there. Identified by local authorities who have been trained to recognize the signs, or reported by frightened neighbors or family members, or detected by inquisitorial agents whose specific function is to find these people before something else does. Those collected, often taken by force, because most psykers are frightened of what they are, and frightened of what happens to people who are taken to the black ships, are transported to Terra. On Terra, they are assessed, tested, evaluated for the strength and stability of their abilities. The strong ones, those with the natural mental resilience to use their abilities without being consumed by them, with the willpower to maintain the psychic barriers that keep warp entities at bay, with the fundamental sanity that the constant exposure to the immaterium requires, may be trained, sanctioned, given a carefully defined role in the Imperium service as astropaths, whose psychic communications allow messages to travel across the galaxy at speeds that conventional means cannot approach, as sanctioned psykers in the Astra Militarum, whose destructive capabilities on a battlefield are genuinely extraordinary, as members of the Inquisition's own retinue, where their abilities are an asset of considerable value. Some, the rarest, the strongest, the most exceptional, eventually become inquisitors themselves. But the strong ones are not the majority. The majority are those whose abilities are real and sometimes powerful, but whose mental stability is insufficient to guarantee safe deployment without catastrophic risk. These are the ones who face a very different fate. The Astronomicon requires continuous power, the psychic lighthouse that keeps warp navigation possible, that blazes from Terra and allows navigators to find their way through the howling immaterium, runs on the life energies of psykers, around 1,000 of them, every single day. Not a number chosen for symbolism, but an operational requirement. The amount of psychic output needed to maintain the beacon across the galaxy at the scale required. They die in this process. Their souls are spent, consumed in the service of the Emperor's light, burned bright, and then extinguished. 1,000 people, every day, for 10,000 years. That is not a calculation that gets easier the more you think about it. But from the Inquisition's perspective, the alternative, the Astronomicon failing, warp navigation becoming impossible, yet the Imperium's million worlds severing contact with each other and with Terra, is a prospect so much worse that the 1,000 daily is considered not just acceptable, but necessary. The fear the Inquisition carries around psykers is also a philosophical one, and this is where it gets interesting. Because the emergence of psychic ability in humanity is not, biologically speaking, an aberration. It is an evolutionary trajectory. Humanity is becoming a psychic species. The proportion of psykers is increasing. The strength of the abilities appearing in the population is, in some assessments, also increasing. This is not random mutation in the negative sense. This is directional development. The Aeldari, the ancient Xenos race, who predate humanity's emergence as a galactic presence by millions of years, are a fully psychic species. Every Aeldari has some degree of natural psychic ability. Their connection to the warp is innate and, because they have had millions of years to develop the mental discipline and cultural frameworks to manage it, generally does not produce the catastrophic results that human psyches generate in large numbers. Humanity is heading in the same direction, but humanity is doing it now, in the 41st millennium, in a galaxy where the warp is at its most turbulent and hostile, where the entities that prey on psychic minds are most numerous and most active, where the timing could not conceivably be worse. And the Inquisition is caught. If they destroyed every psyker, as the most extreme Puritan faction, the monodominants, occasionally advocate, they would destroy the Astronomicon, destroy astropathic communication, and collapse the Imperium in a generation. But if they allow uncontrolled psychic development to proceed without management, the accumulation of unguided psychers bleeding warp energy across millions of worlds would tear the dimensional barrier apart from the inside. The middle path they walk, collecting who they can, training who is trainable, sacrificing who they must, and destroying who they cannot safely do any of the above with, is not a solution. It is a temporary management of a situation that does not have a clean solution yet. Some inquisitors who have studied the pattern believe that the correct endpoint is a fully psychic humanity with the self-knowledge and cultural maturity to handle it. Others believe that before that endpoint could be reached, the transition period, which might last centuries or millennia, would destroy everything in the Imperium that is currently worth preserving. Both arguments have merit. Neither has a resolution, and the black ships keep flying their circuits, and the Astronomicon keeps burning, and every year there are more psychers born than the previous year. Part 4. The Enemy, Wearing Your Neighbor's Face, Genestealer Cults. Here we turn to a fear of a completely different texture. Not the overwhelming cosmological horror of the warp, not the direct confrontation with the demonic, but something quieter, more patient, and in its own way, more insidious than either. Something that wears a human face, speaks in a human voice, works in the same factory you work in, drinks at the same tavern, and has been planning, for years or decades, or sometimes generations, the day when everything around you burns. Genestealer cults, the Tyranids, the great alien hive mind and its vast biological fleet, are the most obvious and overwhelming alien threat to the Imperium. Hive fleets of astronomical scale, consuming entire worlds of their biological mass, are a force that even the most capable Imperial defense can only slow, not stop, without extraordinary effort and sacrifice. They are the great apocalyptic threat on the horizon. But the hive mind is not stupid. In fact, it operates with an intelligence that, while very different from human cognition, is not less capable. And part of its strategy involves not simply arriving with overwhelming force and eating everything in sight. Part of it involves preparation. Bush genestealers are the Tyranid hive mind's vanguard organisms, bioengineered for infiltration, not combat, though they are capable combatants when necessary. They are distributed ahead of the hive fleets, carried on derelict vessels, or smuggled in cargo holds, or lurking in the debris fields of space hulks, moving through the galaxy in ones and twos, finding their way onto inhabited worlds by means that are often mundane and largely undetectable. One genestealer arriving on an inhabited world. It finds a host. The genestealer's reproductive biology includes a mechanism described in Ordo Xenos documentation with clinical detachment as the ovipositor implantation, called by other names by the people who survive the experience, that injects a portion of its genetic code into the host organism. Now, this is not a process that immediately kills or obviously transforms the host. The host survives it. They feel, in the days after, a faint confusion, a sense of meaning that they cannot quite locate. a growing orientation towards something they cannot articulate. They do not understand what has happened to them. Many never do. Their firstborn children are hybrids, not fully human, not fully genestealer, 4 arms perhaps, or an enlarged cranium, or patches of chitinous armor forming beneath the skin. Obviously different in ways that, in the underhive, or the deep mining colony, or the refugee camp where they're likely to be raised, can be hidden under robes and rationalized with effort. These hybrids carry an absolute loyalty to the creature that made them, felt not as compulsion but as something deeper, devotion, and the bone-deep certainty that this is right and good, and what they were made for. The second generation is less obviously alien. The third generation looks mostly human to a casual inspection. And the fourth generation, born of the third, raised in the cult's faith, integrated into its hierarchy, can pass completely as human beings. They get jobs. They join the local militia. They work their way into positions of administrative authority. They present as ordinary citizens, loyal members of society, dedicated workers, and they are working toward one thing. The cult's purpose, experienced by most of its members as religious devotion to what they call the Star Children or the Great Devourer, is to prepare the world for consumption by the hive fleet that is coming, to weaken the world's defenses, confuse its command structures, shall destroy its ability to call for help or mount organized resistance, so that when the Tyranids arrive, the world falls quickly and its biomass can be efficiently processed. The Patriarch, the original genestealer, grown ancient and powerful at the center of the cult's hierarchy, is the psychic nexus around which all of this organizes. Through the broodmind, the Gestalt psychic consciousness connecting every member of the cult, the Patriarch coordinates, plans, watches, waits. A fully mature genestealer cult, one that has had decades or centuries to develop undisturbed, can have members embedded at every level of a world society. The planetary governor's advisors, the senior officers of the planetary defense force, the leadership of the major industrial guilds, the priesthood of the imperial cult. A cult that has grown this deep has, was in effect, already won before it declares itself. When the uprising begins, when the Patriarch judges the moment has come, the defenses have already been quietly dismantled from within. The guns face the wrong direction. The communication systems have been prepared to fail at critical moments. The officers who would coordinate resistance have been replaced, over years, by cult members. The Inquisition knows this pattern. It has had a long time to study it. The Ordo Xenos has developed watch protocols and indicator frameworks, behavioral signs, economic patterns, specific community structures that might suggest cult activity, particular anomalies in census data or recruitment records, or medical reports that, if you know what you're looking at, indicate that something has been seeded and is growing. The problem is the scale and the specificity of the knowledge required. Identifying a genestealer cult in its mature stages, on a world where it has been growing for decades, requires on-the-ground inquisitorial presence of a kind that the Inquisition simply cannot provide everywhere, all the time.
Look, I want to take a second here, just me talking to you directly, because I've been deep in this lore for a long time now, and the thing that keeps pulling me back to the Inquisition specifically, more than any other faction in the setting, is exactly what we've been through today. It's not the power, it's not the aesthetic, it's the way. Every other faction in 40K gets to be defined by what they do. The Space Marines fight, the Necrons endure, the Tyranids consume, but the Inquisition is defined by what they know. And the tragedy of it, the thing that makes them genuinely compelling to me, is that knowing everything they know has not made any of it easier. If anything, the knowing makes it harder, because there's no ignorance left to hide behind. No comfortable story to tell yourself at the end of the day. They chose this, they keep choosing it, and I find that honestly more interesting than any army or campaign in the whole setting. But anyways, let's go back to it.
Consider what happened at Gosar Quintus, a mining colony that had been under the Patriarch's influence for long enough that the situation was comprehensively beyond casual detection. Inquisitor Che Grin arrived with a team of Tempestus scions following reports of a perversion of the imperial creed in the local population. He descended into the facility. He began to find evidence. And then he sent a communique to his colleagues, stating that everything was fine, actually, and that the Trist dynasty running the operation should be left to its own devices and not further investigated. A full year passed before other inquisitors became concerned. The content of his message was wrong, not factually wrong in ways they could immediately identify, but tonally, structurally, motivationally wrong in the way that a psycher's mind-reading reports as off without being able to pinpoint the specific discrepancy. Someone checked, and Che-Grin wasn't responding to follow-up contact. The facility wasn't responding to Imperial traffic in normal ways. A kill team of Deathwatch Space Marines, the Ordo Xenos' chamber militant, warriors specifically trained and equipped for alien threats, was dispatched. They too disappeared. The cult had Che-Grin. At what point it had acquired him, and whether through gradual psychic nudging over the course of his investigation or through a more direct intervention, was never determined. But it had him. And once it had him, it had everything he had: his access codes, his contacts, his knowledge of inquisitorial protocols, his ability to generate communications that would read as legitimate to his colleagues. This is the specific horror of Genestealer cults from the Inquisition's operational perspective. The Patriarch's psychic control over its brood is not easily detectable by conventional means. It does not read as warp corruption on standard Auspex sweeps. It does not produce physical mutations in later generation hybrids that are obviously non-human. An Inquisitor compromised by Genestealer influence will present as an Inquisitor doing their job. A will produce work product that looks like inquisitorial work product, will interact with colleagues in ways that feel like normal interaction. They will just be oriented, subtly, persistently, without their knowledge or consent, in directions that serve the cult's purposes. The Imperium has no reliable, non-invasive test for Genestealer genetic infection. Detecting the psychic influence of the broodmind on a compromised individual requires either a psyker of considerable ability doing a thorough and invasive examination, or catching the person in an inconsistency significant enough to justify that examination when they have every incentive to appear cooperatively consistent. There are worlds, right now, in Imperial space, where this process is underway. Where a single Genestealer that arrived years or decades ago has been quietly, patiently, generation by generation building something, where the signs are there if you know what to look for and have the time and resources to look, where the Inquisition doesn't have presence, hasn't had a visit in years, and won't for several more, and the clock on those worlds is running. Part 5. The Dead Who Don't Stay Dead. Necrons and the Silent Threat. Now we encounter something that doesn't frighten the Inquisition in the same register as the Warp. It frightens them in a colder, quieter way. The way you might be frightened by looking at a geological survey and realizing that the valley your city is built in was, 100,000 years ago, a caldera. The Necrons were a civilization before humanity existed, not just before humanity was a spacefaring species, before humanity as a species, and had done much more than stand upright and make basic tools, before the ancestors of the Eldari had reached their ancient empire, before the beings the Orcs descend from were anything more than a primitive biological weapon. The Necrontyre were already building cities, waging wars, developing technology, and looking at the stars with the specific kind of determination that comes from a species that has decided it deserves better than what it has. They lived on a world irradiated by a hostile star. Their lives were short, devastatingly, bitterly short, and riven by the cancers and radiation sicknesses that came with proximity to that star. They built their civilization with the urgency of people who know time is limited, and they built it well. But the hatred born of that short, painful existence was directed first at the star that cursed them, and then increasingly at the old ones, a species of immensely psychic beings who had mastered warp travel and biological manipulation and who seemed to possess everything the Necrontyre lacked, became the defining psychological driver of their species. They went to war with the old ones. They lost, badly and comprehensively. They returned from that war broken and searching for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. They found the Satan. The Satan, the star gods, as the Necrontyre called them, were ancient entities that predated the Necrontyre by geological ages. They were beings of living energy that had evolved in the physical universe, not the warp, feeding on the electromagnetic output of stars. They were not intelligent in the way mortals are intelligent, not at first. But consciousness developed over millions of years, and with consciousness came desire. And what the Satan desired, when they became aware enough to desire things, was life energy, the raw psychic and biological output of living beings. Stars were sustaining. Living beings were nourishing in a more fundamental way. The Necrontyre, who had discovered these beings feeding on their sun, made contact. A bargain was negotiated, primarily by the Satan called the Deceiver, and the Necrontyre took from it what they heard rather than what was actually offered. The Satan promised immortality. The Necrontyre received something that technically satisfied the definition while emptying it of everything that made it meaningful. They transferred their consciousness into bodies of living metal, necrodermis, a self-repairing metallic substance of extraordinary durability. In a process called biotransference, their biological forms were destroyed. Their consciousness was moved. What they became was the Necrons. Immortal, undying, capable of self-repair that makes conventional destruction of their physical forms a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent solution, and stripped in the transfer of almost everything that had made them who they were: the ability to feel, to dream, to reproduce biologically, to grow as individuals in any direction that wasn't defined by their function. Something in the biotransference, something that the Satan almost certainly intended, took their souls and left something that worked like a soul, but was a copy, a reduced facsimile, a recording of personhood rather than the thing itself. What the Necrons eventually noticed this. They fought the Satan in a war that lasted long enough to exhaust both sides, shattering the Satan into fragments, shards of divine energy imprisoned in multidimensional containers, and then retreating into hibernation in their tomb worlds. The Great Sleep, a dormancy that was supposed to last until the galaxy had stabilized enough for the Necrons to claim their place in it. They slept for 60 million years. They are waking up now. In the late 41st millennium, tomb worlds across the galaxy are activating. Automated systems that maintained the Necrons through their long sleep are bringing them back online in various states of functionality. Some dynasties are waking coherent, their lords still possessing the personality structures and strategic acuity that defined them in life. Others are waking fragmented, their personality matrices degraded by the passage of time and the imperfect maintenance of their storage systems, producing Necrons that are effectively mindless killing machines, guided only by ancient programming. The Inquisition's specific fears regarding the Necrons are layered and compounding. The most immediate is the tactical problem. Conventional weapons have limited effectiveness on Necron forces in sustained engagements. The living metal of their bodies self-repairs in real time. A Necron warrior reduced to components by bolter fire will, if left undisturbed for a few moments, begin to reassemble itself. The components literally move, guided by residual programming, and reconnect. What appears to be a cleared area is a temporary condition, as destroying a Necron permanently requires either weaponry calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities of the necrodermis, which require very specific knowledge that the Adeptus Mechanicus has been slow to acquire and reluctant to share, or overwhelming force of a scale that renders the individual Necron's self-repair capability irrelevant. This makes fighting them expensive in ways that compound over a campaign. Imperial forces that rely on firepower to create windows of opportunity find those windows closing faster than expected. The second layer is their technology. Necron technology operates on principles that the Imperium does not understand and cannot replicate. The most advanced technological society of the current era, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the keepers of Imperial technology, whose entire culture is built around the worship and preservation of knowledge, cannot reverse engineer most Necron technology, Gauss weapons that strip matter at an atomic level, phase technology that allows units to move through solid matter briefly, temporal manipulation devices that distort local time flows, Dolmen gates that allow faster-than-light travel without using the warp at all, bypassing the warp's dangers entirely. Superweapons like the World Engine, a moon-sized war machine capable of consuming planets that are not theoretical but documented. The Cetan shards, still imprisoned in their tesseract labyrinths but not destroyed, are deployed occasionally as weapons of enormous capability. A Cetan shard is a fragment of a being that predates most of the current universe's major features. On the level of reality manipulation it can perform is genuinely outside any conventional scale of measurement. The third layer is the intelligence problem. When the Inquisition's xenosavants first began piecing together that the strange incidents of mysterious alien raids across the galaxy were connected, that they were not unrelated events, but early symptoms of a single, large-scale phenomenon. What struck them was how long it had taken to recognize the pattern. The evidence had been there, but it had been systematically difficult to compile because the Necrons appeared to possess technology specifically designed to suppress the evidence of their own existence. Their presence disrupts detection equipment. Accounts from survivors are confused and contradictory in ways that don't neatly match standard trauma responses. Data storage in areas affected by Necron operations fails in patterns that suggest active interference rather than incidental damage. Piecing together a coherent intelligence picture of Necron activity requires more than the normal difficulty, because the enemy is actively working to prevent the picture from being formed. An organization whose entire operational model depends on gathering and analyzing information finds an enemy that actively suppresses the creation of that information, uniquely troubling. And then there is the Void Dragon. This is where the Inquisition's fear of the Necrons reaches into a dimension that most Inquisitors prefer not to think about for extended periods. Among the Cetan, the Void Dragon was associated with the physical laws governing matter and technology, the dominion over machines, or the ability to understand and manipulate the principles that make technology work at a fundamental level. In certain restricted inquisitorial archives, there exists a hypothesis, based on evidence that is incomplete but consistent, that the Void Dragon is not currently imprisoned on some distant tomb world, that it came, at some point in history, to rest beneath the surface of Mars, that the entity which the Adeptus Mechanicus has been dimly aware of for thousands of years as a spiritual presence in their technology, the Omnissiah, the machine god, might be, in some configuration, a sleeping Catan of incalculable power resting at the heart of the most important forge world in the Imperium. If this is accurate, and it is not confirmed, but the people who have studied it carefully tend to develop persistent habits of watching the data feeds from Mars with particular attention, then the Adeptus Mechanicus has spent 10,000 years building their most sacred institutions in close proximity to a sleeping god of technology, a god that, if it woke, could exercise influence over every machine in the Imperium in ways that might not be immediately distinguishable from normal machine spirit activity until the damage was irreversible. The Inquisitors who have full clearance on this file tend to keep it from their minds in the way you keep your eyes away from something that doesn't help you function if you look at it too long, because the question of what to do about it has no satisfying answers. Tell the Mechanicus, they would not receive the information well, and the institutional fallout would be catastrophic. Keep it quiet. Continue the 10,000-year policy of watching and hoping and not touching it. That is what they do. Watch, hope, and try not to think about what happens if the dragon stirs. Part 6. The Long War Chaos, Space Marines and 10,000 Years of Hate. Among the many things the Inquisition faces, there is one category of threat that occupies a uniquely complicated space. Not because they are the most powerful enemy. They are not, compared to some of the forces we've discussed, but because of what they are, and what it means that they are. Chaos Space Marines are the Inquisition's most philosophically disturbing enemy. They are not monsters from another dimension. They are not incomprehensible alien intelligences. They are not ancient robots awakening from eons of sleep. They are fallen Space Marines. Warriors who were once among the finest the Imperium ever produced, whose genetic heritage is as noble as the Emperor's own craft could make it, who fought in the Great Crusade and helped build the civilization that now endures, who swore the same oaths and fought for the same purposes, and who turned. The Horus heresy is the origin point, and it is important to understand its scale. The Emperor had 18 Primarchs, 18 genetically engineered demigod commanders, each leading a legion of Space Marines numbering in the tens of thousands. These were the instruments of his Great Crusade, the force by which he intended to reunite humanity and build an empire that could withstand any threat. 9 of them turned against him, not all at once, not easily. The process of their corruption varied by legion and by individual, Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, who found in the Chaos Gods the genuine divinity he had always craved. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, whose pursuit of perfection led him down a path that Slaanesh had been patiently building for him for decades. Angron of the World Eaters, whose rage had been amplified past any capacity for reason by psychic surgery. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, whose resentment at being tasked with unglamorous siege work while others received the glory drove him toward a darker gratitude. And Horus himself, the most beloved, the War Master, the Emperor's right hand, whose pride and ambition and genuine belief that the Emperor had abandoned his sons was enough to start the chain that consumed the galaxy. Yet the 9 traitor Primarchs led their legions into rebellion, and ultimately, after the disaster of the Siege of Terra and the Emperor's near death, into the Eye of Terror. There they have existed for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Inside the Eye of Terror, where time does not pass with the consistency it does outside. Where warp energy is so dense that mutations accumulate rapidly, that demon princes are born from those who serve well enough and long enough, that warriors who entered in the 31st millennium are still fighting today, carrying grudges that have had 10,000 years to calcify and sharpen. They call what they do the Long War, and they pursue it with a patience and a dedication that reflect something important about the nature of chaos and the nature of time in the eye. They do not age the way mortals age. They do not forget. The warriors who faced the Emperor's own custodians at the Siege of Terror and survived are still out there, somewhere in the eye's depths, and their memory of that battle is not a historical record, but a direct sensory experience they can return to as clearly as a vivid dream. The Inquisition's specific fear regarding Chaos Space Marines is threefold. The first is the knowledge asymmetry. Chaos Space Marines of the Heresy era. Legions know things about the Adeptus Astartes, the current Space Marine chapters that trace their lineage back to those original legions, that those chapters may have lost. They know the founding philosophies, the psychological pressure points. As the specific combat doctrines developed in an era before the Codex Astartes divided the legions into smaller chapters and standardized many aspects of Space Marine warfare. They have intelligence on how Space Marines think and fight that is more detailed, in some cases, than what the modern chapters know about themselves. The second is the cults. The traitor legions have spent 10,000 years maintaining and cultivating networks of chaos worshippers on loyal Imperial worlds. These are not passive populations waiting to be activated. They are active communities with internal hierarchies, with practices and traditions, with connections to other cults across sectors. with sleeper agents in positions of genuine influence. Every Black Crusade, the large-scale military invasions led by Abaddon the Despoiler out of the Eye of Terror, one of which there have been 13 before the current era, has been preceded by a period of intense cult activity, of sabotage and assassination and strategic confusion being generated behind imperial lines by people who have been living as loyal citizens for years or decades. The third is the event the last Black Crusade produced, the fall of Cadia, the fortress world that had stood for thousands of years as the sentinel of the Eye of Terror, maintained at enormous cost in lives and resources, treated as a military and spiritual necessity, fell. It fell not simply because Abaddon brought overwhelming force, though he did. It fell because the Cadians fought until the last, and were still not enough, and in the fighting the planet's physical structure was broken beyond recovery. And with it went a great deal of the practical and symbolic value it had provided. The cicatrix maledictum followed, the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning wound that the fall of Cadia enabled, the catastrophic worsening of the warp environment that had always been the nightmare scenario, the thing that previous generations had accepted any cost to prevent. It happened anyway. For the Inquisition, this is not simply a military loss. It is evidence that the strategy of holding the line, of maintaining the existing defenses, of treating stability as the primary goal, of sacrificing everything necessary to prevent things from getting worse, has a point at which it stops working. The line was held for 10,000 years, and then it wasn't. What that means for the next 10,000 years is a question the Inquisition is currently working very hard to answer. Part 7. The knife that cuts the hand that holds it. Forbidden knowledge and the radical problem. Here we reach one of the most intellectually compelling and practically dangerous aspects of the Inquisition's existence. The Inquisition is afraid of its own tools, not in a dramatic or theatrical way, in a very specific, practically grounded way that comes from thousands of years of watching what happens to people who spend extended careers in close proximity to the darkest things the galaxy produces. To fight the warp, you must understand the warp. To identify demonic possession, you must know what possession looks like from the inside. To combat chaos corruption, you must recognize it at every stage of development, which means knowing what it feels like in early stages, which means knowing what it feels like to be tempted by it. To hunt genestealer cults, you must understand how the broodmind works, which means spending time thinking about it carefully, which means creating a framework in your mind for how that thinking works. None of this is achievable from a safe distance with clean hands. The Inquisition's expertise is bought at a cost, and the cost is paid in proximity to the things they fight. Every piece of forbidden knowledge in the Inquisition's vaults, and there are enormous, temperature-controlled, are psychically warded vaults on multiple worlds containing texts and artifacts whose contents are classified above the level of most imperial institutions' highest clearance, was acquired because someone was close enough to the relevant horror to acquire it, and skilled enough to survive the acquisition, and disciplined enough to write it down afterward. That person was changed by the experience. Every person who is genuinely engaged with chaos law, with warp entities, with the actual content of the forbidden texts, has been changed. The question the Inquisition asks is not whether the change occurs. It does, always, but whether the changed person remains oriented toward the Imperium's service or has been nudged incrementally towards something else. This is the radical problem. Radical inquisitors are those who have concluded, through their experience and their assessment of the available options, that fighting the enemies of the Imperium requires using the tools of those enemies. Demon hosts, humans bound to demons, used as weapons under the binding Inquisitor's control. Warp sorcery, turned against those who deploy it. Xenotech, the technology of alien races, employed because it works better than the sanctioned alternatives in specific situations. Alliances with beings that no Orthodox Inquisitor would be within 10 meters of. made because information is information, and sometimes the entity that has it is something monstrous. And radical inquisitors are, very frequently, not wrong in the immediate term. The demon they bound helped them close the rift that 3 Puritan inquisitors failed to close using approved methods. At the Xenos artifact they deployed against the Genestealer Patriarch when conventional weapons were failing, stopped the uprising at the cost of a planet rather than a sector. The information extracted from a corrupted text allowed them to predict the Chaos Warband's movements and eliminate them before the campaign they were building toward could launch. The logic is correct. The outcomes are frequently better than what the Puritan alternatives would have produced. And still the Puritans look at the radicals and see the future they represent as clearly as if it were written in fire on the sky, because they have been looking at the Inquisition's history for long enough to see the pattern. The radicals, who make one exception, tend to make another. Each exception is as logical as the first. Each is genuinely warranted by the circumstances, and each moves the Inquisitor, invisibly and imperceptibly from the inside, a small increment further from where they started. The slope is real. The Inquisition's historical records show it to be real, in case after case across 10,000 years. Gregor Eisenhorn is the most famous documented case, and also, in many ways, the most honest one, because the accounts of his career are extensive and available to inquisitors with the relevant clearance, and those accounts show the movement so clearly. A man who began as a strict adherent to approved methods, who made his first exception under circumstances that genuinely warranted an exception. The alternative would have been worse. Who made his second exception 6 years later, same reasoning, different details. Who by the midpoint of his documented career had made so many exceptions that his relationship to the original rule set was more conceptual than operational. Who ended, by the final documented period, in possession of a bound demon host that he had created himself and controlled, deploying it as a weapon against threats that he assessed as requiring exactly that response. Who still, by his own lights and by any honest assessment of the outcomes he produced, believed himself to be serving the Imperium and humanity. Who had not crossed the line he understood himself to stand at, even though the line he stood at bore almost no resemblance to the line he had started at. This is the Inquisition's fear of itself. Not that radicals are secretly working for chaos. Most of them aren't. Most of them are exactly who they say they are. Inquisitors doing their job in the way they believe is most effective, paying costs they consider acceptable for outcomes they believe are necessary. The fear is that the definition of acceptable cost drifts, that the definition of necessary outcome drifts, that the accumulated weight of exceptions and compromises and pragmatic decisions made in the heat of genuine crisis creates, over time, a person who would be unrecognizable to their earlier self, oriented toward things their earlier self would have fought. And sometimes, not always, not inevitably, but documented, recorded, traceable in the archives, the drift doesn't stop at a destination that still serves the Imperium. Sometimes it reaches the point where the Inquisitor is working in direct or indirect service of the things they were created to destroy, not from betrayal of their values, but from the patient, long-term erosion of what those values were originally connected to. When this happens, other Inquisitors find out, eventually, and what follows is one of the most uncomfortable things the Inquisition does, which is hunt its own. Part 8. The Watchers Watched. The Inquisition against itself. The previous section leads almost inevitably to this one, because if the greatest operational risk the Inquisition faces is the potential corruption of its own members, then the question of who monitors the monitors becomes pressing and genuinely difficult to answer satisfactorily. The Inquisition's answer to this problem is itself. Other Inquisitors. Yet in an organization with no formal accountability to any external body, answerable only to the Emperor, which is functionally answerable to no one currently capable of answering back. The only check on an individual Inquisitor's actions is the judgment of their peers. This creates a situation of considerable psychological complexity for every Inquisitor active in the field. they carry, at all times, the awareness that every decision they make, every method they employ, every alliance they form, every exception they grant themselves, all of it is potential evidence in a future assessment of their character and conduct. The Inquisition does not usually operate surveillance programs on its own members, but it is very attentive to anomalies, to patterns, to the kind of inconsistencies that suggest someone is operating in ways they are not reporting fully to their colleagues. The fear this generates is real and specific. An inquisitor who has made decisions that were correct and necessary and that they would stand by in any formal tribunal still carries the knowledge that a sufficiently motivated colleague with a sufficiently different philosophical orientation could interpret those same decisions as evidence of corruption. The difference between a radical and a heretic is, in many cases, who is framing the narrative and what evidence they have access to. And there are entities in the galaxy that understand this, that know how the Inquisition works from the inside and are patient enough and intelligent enough to exploit that knowledge. Genestealer patriarchs, as discussed. His can compromise an inquisitor in ways that produce no obvious evidence. Chaos cults with deep enough infiltration of the Inquisition's support networks can plant evidence, redirect investigations, ensure that the most capable inquisitors working against them are occupied fighting each other rather than fighting the cult. The Months of Shame is the most publicly known case of the Inquisition, causing enormous damage through its internal dynamics. But it is not the only one. It is simply the one that became visible enough that historians could reconstruct it in any detail. There are incidents in restricted archives that were contained before they reached that scale of visibility, and the containing was itself violent and damaging in ways that never became part of the accessible record. The specific fear this generates is not paranoia, though the line between appropriate professional vigilance and counterproductive paranoia is one that senior inquisitors spend considerable energy trying to maintain clearly in their own psychology. The fear is structural. It is the recognition that an organization that must police threats at every level of the Imperium, threats that include the possibility of its own corruption, will inevitably face moments where it cannot clearly distinguish between a legitimate threat being addressed and a legitimate threat that has been manufactured by an adversary to occupy the Inquisition's attention while the real threat proceeds uncontested. There is no structural solution to this. The Inquisition has tried various approaches: internal review bodies, mandatory conclave reporting, rotating assignment protocols designed to prevent inquisitors from developing entrenched relationships in specific sectors that might compromise their judgment. None of them is adequate. None of them can be adequate, because the resources required to genuinely monitor everyone all the time would exceed the entire operational capacity of the organization and would leave no one free to actually investigate the external threats. What they have instead is institutional memory, mutual wariness, and the uncomfortable understanding that sometimes the person who catches the rogue inquisitor will be the next rogue inquisitor, and the one who catches them will be the next one after that. And the cycle does not end because it cannot end. The Inquisition is afraid of becoming what it hunts. The honest ones will tell you, quietly, that the primary thing standing between them and that outcome is the effort of will they apply every day, and that they are aware it is not a failsafe. Part 9. The galaxy consumes itself. The tyrannid hive mind and unprecedented hunger. There is a category of threat on the Inquisition's register that doesn't fit cleanly into the framework of the other fears we've discussed. Most threats the Inquisition faces have some quality that allows, at least in theory, for a strategic response. Chaos can be contained. Genestealer cults can be identified and purged. Necrons can be engaged militarily with appropriate preparation. Even the most extreme demonic incursions can be fought if the right resources are brought to bear. The Tyranids are different in a way that the Inquisition finds difficult to fully assimilate into its threat frameworks. They are not a civilization. They have no politics, no internal dissensions that can be exploited through diplomacy or intelligence operations, no goals that can be negotiated or reasoned with, no internal structure that can be destabilized by targeting leadership. They are a single gestalt consciousness, the hive mind, expressing itself through billions of specialized biological forms, operating with perfect coordination and absolute efficiency in the pursuit of one objective: biomass. Everything, every organic molecule, every forest and ocean and city and person on a targeted world is to be consumed and processed and turned into more tyranids, which will then move on to the next target. The hive mind is not malicious. It has no more malice toward its targets than a wildfire has malice toward a forest. It simply proceeds. This is, from a certain angle, the most hopeless feeling threat on the Inquisition's list, because there is no argument to make to it. The persuasion, the intelligence operations, the subtle manipulation of internal politics that are among the Inquisition's most effective long-term tools, none of these have any purchase on an entity that does not contain any of the human psychological dynamics they depend on. The shadow in the warp precedes the hive fleets, disrupting psychic communication in affected regions. As the fleet approaches, astropathic contact becomes unreliable, then intermittent, then impossible. Navigating into the shadow's influence becomes disorienting and dangerous. Worlds facing Tyranid invasion lose the ability to call for help from outside the affected zone before the invasion begins. The isolation is designed. It is a function of the hive mind's presence. For the Inquisition, which depends entirely on communication networks and information flow, operating in the zone of a shadow is working partially blind. Intelligence gathering becomes difficult. Coordination with other inquisitorial teams becomes impaired. The standard framework of investigation, assessment, and response requires reliable information, and the shadow degrades the reliability of information at exactly the moment when reliable information is most critical. The hive mind's capacity to adapt is the second dimension of the Inquisition's fear. The Tyranids encountered in each wave of incursion are not identical to those encountered in the previous wave. Each fleet that is engaged, each weapon system deployed against them, in each defensive tactic that achieves measurable success, the data is absorbed. New bioforms appear that are specifically resistant to the things that worked previously. Armor compositions change to resist the weapons that penetrated them. Attack patterns evolve to circumvent the defensive structures that proved effective before. The hive mind learns, slowly, in human terms, but across multiple incursions. The learning is visible, and the Inquisition's xenosavants, who study the comparative records, find it alarming. What worked in the first tyrannic war worked less well in the second. The Tyranids that arrived in the second were measurably different from those in the first, in ways that tracked directly to the lessons absorbed from the earlier conflict. The third dimension is the scale question. Of the hive fleets the Imperium has encountered, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and several smaller incursions, are not, in the assessment of Inquisitors, who have access to the full spectrum of sensor data and comparative analysis, the whole of the Tyranid presence in the galaxy. They are the advance elements, the vanguard portions of a swarm whose main body exists beyond the galactic rim and whose total scale is, based on the extrapolations available, dramatically larger than anything the galaxy has yet faced. Inquisitor Cryptman, one of the more controversial figures in modern inquisitorial history, concluded from his analysis of the Tyranid threat that the hive fleets already encountered represent something like a fraction of what is coming, and that the Imperium, even deploying everything it has on its best day, cannot defeat the full swarm in direct confrontation. His proposed solution was to divert the approaching fleets by seeding genestealer infestations on worlds in the fleet's paths, creating psychic beacons that would attract the hive mind toward those worlds, rather than allowing the fleets to choose their own targets. This would slow and redirect the advance, buying time for stronger defenses to be established elsewhere. The plan would condemn the populations of the worlds used as bait to certain Tyranid consumption. Cryptman was aware of this. He considered it an acceptable operational cost. the Inquisition censured him and effectively exiled him from the mainstream organization. His methods were declared unacceptable. His analysis of the Tyranid threat was not meaningfully refuted. And this is the shape of the Inquisition's fear of the Tyranids, a threat for which they genuinely do not have an adequate response, whose scale may exceed any conceivable framework for fighting it, which cannot be reasoned with, or manipulated or divided against itself, and which, based on the available intelligence, has not yet fully arrived. Part 10. The deepest fear, the Emperor, the throne, and what comes after. And here we arrive at the thing beneath everything else. The fear that sits at the foundation of all the other fears. The thing that the Inquisition cannot name in official documents, that is referenced obliquely in classified materials, that senior inquisitors discuss with each other only in private with very carefully chosen words. The Emperor is dying. He has been dying for 10,000 years. What, he was mortally wounded at the Siege of Terra in the final battle against Horus, when Horus was at the height of his chaos-empowered capability, and the Emperor, holding back in the hope of saving his son, allowed the damage to go too far before acting. The wound was beyond any biological repair. His body could no longer sustain itself independently. He was placed in the Golden Throne, a device of human technological achievement from the pre-heresy era, built for a very different purpose than the one it now serves. And there he has existed since. Not dead, not alive in the way he was before. Something in between. His consciousness endures. His psychic power endures. His ability to sustain the Astronomicon endures. But the man who walked and spoke and led and built is not accessible. The Emperor, as a presence in the Imperium, is the warm glow of something very powerful that has been wrapped in layers of institutional religion and 10,000 years of telephone game interpretation. The Golden Throne, meanwhile, was built by people who are no longer alive to maintain it. Its maintenance falls to the Adeptus Mechanicus, who understand parts of it, the more conventional engineering components, the power systems, the biological life support elements, but not all of it, and not the most fundamental parts. The throne was built incorporating technology that predates the current Imperium, and certain aspects of that technology are not understood by anyone currently living well enough to repair or replace them if they fail. They are failing, not all at once, not dramatically, in the incremental, slow-motion way of ancient systems under continuous stress, each component degrading at a rate that individually seems manageable, but which, in aggregate, represents a trajectory toward the moment when the numbers stop working. The Inquisition knows this. The most senior members know more of it than the general organization. There are Ordos Minoris, whose specific function is to monitor the status of the Astronomicon, and the reports coming from the Mechanicus teams tasked with throne maintenance, to identify the rate of degradation and project forward, and to consider, very quietly and privately, what the options are if a crisis point approaches. There are no good options. There are less bad options, and options that are very bad, and options that have simply not been thought of yet, because the problem is so far outside any previous operational experience that the frameworks for thinking about it are being built from scratch by people who are also managing everything else on this list simultaneously. If the Emperor truly dies, permanent cessation, not the current interment but actual ending, the Astronomicon goes dark. Without it, warp navigation becomes a matter of blind luck. Ships will be lost in transit in numbers that make current ship losses look trivial. The million worlds of the Imperium will begin to lose contact with each other and with Terra. Within a human lifetime, if not sooner, the civilization begins to fragment into isolated pockets. And in a galaxy containing everything we have discussed today, demons and chaos gods and genestealer cults and awakening necrons and approaching Tyranid fleets, isolated pockets of humanity do not last long. The opening of the Great Rift accelerated every timeline connected to this concern, cutting the Imperium in two, making large portions of it functionally unreachable under current conditions, flooding enormous swathes of space with warp energy. All of this brought certain projections that had previously pointed to several centuries forward by decades. The emergence of Robert Guilliman changed the conversation about this, if it did not resolve it. The resurrected Primarch returned through means involving Eldari power and intervention in ways that the Mechanicus is still not entirely comfortable with, but it represents the first genuinely new variable in the Imperium's strategic situation in a very long time. He has, in the years since his return, pushed through the Primaris Space Marine program, forced institutional reforms that many in the Inquisition viewed with wariness, insisted on a degree of transparency about the Imperium's actual situation that runs directly against 10,000 years of inquisitorial information suppression policy. He reviewed the historical records. He read what had been done and how and why, and he expressed in formal documented sessions that will be classified at the highest levels for generations, his view that the Inquisition's core methodology, the suppression of knowledge, the management of ignorance as a defensive strategy, out the idea that keeping the population unaware of what it faces protects it, has been a significant contributor to the Imperium's current fragility. A population that doesn't know what is threatening it cannot make informed choices about how to face those threats. It cannot develop cultural resilience against chaos corruption because it doesn't know what chaos corruption looks like. It cannot recognize genestealer cult activity because it has never been told what to look for. It cannot understand why the Inquisition does what it does. And so, when the Inquisition burns worlds and mind wipes populations and demands impossible sacrifices, the population sees only arbitrary cruelty rather than desperate necessity. Guilliman and the Inquisition do not agree on how to handle this, but they are unlikely to resolve the disagreement cleanly in the short term. The Inquisition's institutional position that the knowledge is more dangerous than the ignorance is not simply arrogance. It is based on 10,000 years of watching what happens when knowledge of chaos spreads. The historical record supports the concern, but the historical record also shows an Imperium that is losing ground. Slowly, with enormous effort, with extraordinary sacrifice, but losing. The strategy has not been without value, but the strategy has also not been sufficient. And the question of whether sufficient can be achieved within the current framework, or whether the current framework is itself part of what is insufficient, is the deepest and most difficult question the Inquisition is currently unable to answer. As conclusion, the candle in the dark and what it knows. There is a way of describing the Inquisition's role that I keep returning to, because it is, I think, precisely accurate in a way that goes beyond decoration. The Inquisition is the candle in the darkness, not the sun, not a blaze that illuminates everything and makes the dark impossible. A candle, a small, carefully maintained flame, lit against a darkness that enormously exceeds it, held by hands that are tired but have not yet let go. The fears we've explored today, the warp and its nature, the demonic secret and what containing it costs, the rising psychic tide of humanity's own evolution, the quiet horror of the genestealer infestation, the ancient cold patience of the Necrons, and the Satan sleeping beneath imperial foundations, and the long war of warriors who have carried their grudge for 10,000 years, the way that the tools of the fight corrupt those who wield them, the internal fractures of an organization too powerful to be held accountable by anything external, the unprecedented appetite of the hive mind and the scale of what may be coming, and beneath all of it the failing certainty of the Emperor's continued endurance. These are not abstract. They are happening, right now, in the setting of the 41st millennium, simultaneously, across 1 million worlds, with more resources than any single threat response requires, and fewer resources than the combined demands of all of them taken together. The Inquisition is not enough to stop all of them. It was never designed to be. The original mandate was not to eliminate all threats to humanity, which would require omnipotence that no organization can possess. The mandate was to identify, delay, contain, and buy time, to keep the candle burning long enough for something better to become possible. What makes the Inquisition's fear both terrible and in some way admirable is that they understand this. They understand the full scope of what they face. They have access to the most comprehensive picture of the galaxy's dangers that any human institution possesses. They know that the picture is incomplete. They know that things they haven't found yet are out there, and that by the time they find them, they may already be crises rather than early-stage threats, and they keep going anyway. The specific terror of the Inquisition's existence is not the monsters. The monsters are almost simpler than the alternative, because monsters can be fought. The terror is the mathematics, the constant, grinding calculation of acceptable loss and necessary sacrifice, and which world to save, and which world to burn, and how many years a particular containment buys, and whether those years are enough for something to change. Inquisitor Cryptman's famous statement, borrowed sometimes for dramatic effect, but genuine in its original context, captures it. You may claim I have no right to act as I do, but those who truly understand know that I have no right to let them live. That is not the philosophy of a monster. It is the philosophy of a person who has looked at the full picture and concluded that the math requires it. The horror is that, in the context of the 41st millennium's actual strategic situation, the conclusion is not obviously wrong. As the Inquisition is afraid. They are afraid of the specific things on this list, and they are afraid of the cumulative weight of all of them together, and they are afraid of themselves, and of what the job demands they become, and of the possibility that the thing they have spent 10,000 years protecting might already be broken in ways that cannot be fixed by any amount of burning or suppressing or sacrificing, and they keep going. Because the alternative, the absence of the candle, is a dark that, based on what they know, nothing currently existing would survive long in. That is what the Inquisition is afraid of. And now you know. If you made it to the end of this, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of deep lore exploration that I built this channel for, and the fact that you're here for it means everything. There's so much more to cover in this setting. The specific histories, the individual inquisitors, the moments where it all nearly came apart, the corners of the lore that almost nobody talks about, and new videos are coming regularly. If this one gave you something worth thinking about, hit the like button. It helps more than you know, and if you're not subscribed yet, the button is right there, and every time a new video goes up, you'll be the first to know. Drop a comment with the fear you think is most underestimated, whether that's something on this list or something we didn't cover today. I read every one of them, and they genuinely shape what we explore next. Take care of yourselves. The Emperor protects. Manuscript. What the Inquisition is afraid of. Q. On 40,000 extended section. The color of corruption. Understanding how chaos actually spreads. It is worth pausing before we move on from the subject of chaos to examine something that the Inquisition understands very precisely and that most of the Imperium's population has no framework for at all. Chaos corruption is not a dramatic, sudden thing. It does not announce itself. The people who have ended up fully in the service of the ruinous powers, the cultists running their hidden ceremonies in the sub-basements of hive cities, the rogue psychers becoming conduits for demonic energy, us the officers and governors who have traded their loyalty for power or extended life or the cessation of some particular pain, the overwhelming majority of them did not wake up one morning and decide to serve chaos. They slipped. The warp is described in inquisitorial documentation as responsive to emotional states. This is accurate as far as it goes, but it understates the active, intelligent quality of the interaction. The Chaos Gods are not simply passively receiving the emotional output of mortal beings. They are interested. They are, in the fashion of beings whose entire existence is made of psychic energy and whose power grows proportional to the feelings they generate in living beings, paying attention. A person under sustained stress is, in ways they cannot perceive, slightly more visible to warp entities than a person at peace. Not dramatically more visible, not enough to matter individually in isolation. But a person whose stress is chronic, who lives in the kind of grinding, hopeless, economically desperate, physically dangerous environment that is the baseline for most of the Imperium's trillion-strong population, accumulates a kind of psychic resonance that the entities of the warp find attention-catching. This does not mean that stressed people inevitably become chaos worshippers. The vast majority do not. The warp is there, always paying attention, and most people live entire lives without ever being touched by it in a way they notice. Faith in the Emperor, in community, in the small shared rituals that give daily life structure and meaning, provides a kind of psychic insulation that the warp cannot easily penetrate. But the Inquisition's specific fear is about the pathways, about the specific, identifiable, documented mechanisms by which ordinary people travel from their ordinary lives to the moment where they are doing something that serves chaos. Desperation is one pathway. A person who has lost everything, whose family has died, whose livelihood has been destroyed, whose community has been shattered by one of the many, many disasters that routinely occur in the 41st millennium, may reach a moment where they will listen to anything that offers them the possibility of improvement. In that moment, something in the warp that is tuned to that frequency, that feeds on despair, that grows larger when hopelessness intensifies, can begin to whisper. Not dramatically, not with obvious supernatural theatre, just as a feeling that there is something out there, a conviction growing slowly that conventional prayer to the Emperor has not helped and something different is worth trying. The first step is nothing. The first step is just a question, just an openness, just a willingness to think differently. The cultists who recruit on behalf of the Chaos powers know this. Their initial pitch is rarely, "Join our murderous cult dedicated to entities of psychic evil." Their initial pitch is much more mundane: relief, community, purpose, the sense of being part of something that acknowledges what is true about the world you're living in, rather than insisting on the official version. The Ordo Hereticus, the witch hunters, the inquisitors of the third major ordo, whose mandate is the internal human threat, have catalogued these pathways extensively. They know, in considerable detail, how a chaos cult forms and grows, what the progression looks like, which communities are most vulnerable, what the early indicators are. This knowledge is one of the most valuable things the Ordo Hereticus possesses. It is also one of the most carefully controlled, because the knowledge of how chaos recruitment works is, if presented in the wrong way to the wrong audience, itself a pathway. This is the specific recursive horror at the heart of the Inquisition's relationship to knowledge about chaos. The better they understand it, the more useful their understanding becomes, and the more dangerous the act of understanding is. Extended section: the Ordo Hereticus and the fear of human weakness. The Ordo Hereticus is sometimes overlooked in discussions of the Inquisition's most dramatic operations. The Ordo Malleus faces actual demons. The Ordo Xenos hunts galaxy-threatening alien presences. The Ordo Hereticus chases heretics and mutants and rogue psychers and cults that might, if you let them get out of hand, become serious problems. This framing does the Ordo Hereticus a profound injustice. The Ordo Hereticus is the largest of the three major ordos. Its mandate, the internal threats to the Imperium from within its own populations and institutions, is effectively unlimited in scope because the internal threats are everywhere, because the Imperium is governed by human beings, and human beings, under the right pressures, find ways to fail in every direction simultaneously. The primary mandate of the Ordo Hereticus encompasses heresy, mutation, and unsanctioned psychic activity. In the 41st millennium, in each of these categories covers an enormous amount of ground. Heresy, in the Inquisition's understanding, is not simply theological disagreement. It is any significant deviation from the imperial creed, or the sanctioned structures of imperial authority that creates pathways toward chaos corruption or alien influence. In practice, this means that the Ordo Hereticus has jurisdiction over almost any form of significant dissent or social disruption. because almost any of these can, in the right circumstances, become the kind of crack through which warp influence enters. Mutation is the physical evidence of chaos's touch on the human genome. The warp corrupts matter as well as minds and souls, and populations exposed to warp energy over extended periods begin to show physical changes: extra limbs, transformed facial features, and so biological structures that don't correspond to human anatomy. Most of these mutations are irrelevant in functional terms. The mutant is not necessarily corrupted in any spiritual sense, but they represent, to the Ordo Hereticus, a vector, a population that has been statistically closer to warp influence than average, that may have family members who were more seriously corrupted, that exists in communities where the exposure that produced the mutation is ongoing. The Ordo Hereticus's fear is the fear of the second derivative, not just the corruption that exists right now, but the rate of change of the corruption. A single heretical cult, cleanly identified and eliminated, is not the existential problem. The existential problem is the rate at which new cults form, the rate at which existing ones recruit, and the rate at which the conditions that produce heresy and mutation are being reproduced faster than the Ordo Hereticus can address them. On most imperial worlds, conditions are not improving. The economy of the Imperium is built on tithing, worlds giving proportional resources and manpower to the greater imperial war machine. And the war machine's needs grow while the productive capacity of individual worlds often doesn't. The result is a slow, structural squeeze that creates the kind of desperate, hopeless, angry populations that chaos recruitment pitches are designed for. The Ordo Hereticus can hunt cults. It can identify and eliminate individual heretics, sanctioned psychers who go rogue, mutant communities that have become politically destabilizing. It cannot fix the economic conditions of a million worlds. It cannot address the fundamental structural pressures that produce the populations it spends its time managing. It operates downstream of causes it has no authority to touch. This is a particular flavor of institutional frustration that the Ordo Hereticus carries. They can see the machinery producing the problems they fight. They understand, clearly, that what they do is more like mopping up water from a flooding floor than fixing the pipe. And they keep mopping because not mopping produces worse outcomes, even though mopping does nothing about the pipe. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the Order Militant attached to the Ordo Hereticus, are among the most formidable military assets in the Imperium. Their devotion to the Emperor is not merely ideological but practically powerful. Their faith provides psychic protection of a kind that is demonstrably effective against both demonic influence and chaos sorcery. They are the hammer with which the Ordo Hereticus strikes, and they strike often and hard, because the supply of things requiring striking is effectively unlimited. The fear that underlies the Ordo Hereticus's entire operation is the simple statistical one. If the proportion of imperial citizens who are in some stage of chaos, influence, or cult affiliation is even 1%, and some internal assessments suggest the number may be higher, that is, trillions of people. The Inquisition, in total, numbers in the millions, including all support and acolyte networks. The math does not produce comfortable reading. An extended section, the toll road of a career. What becoming an Inquisitor does to a person. Something that doesn't receive enough attention in discussions of the Inquisition is what the work actually does to the people who do it over the course of a full career. Inquisitors are exceptional people. They are selected for their intelligence, their resilience, their moral clarity, their psychological stability, their ability to function under extreme stress while making decisions of enormous consequence. The selection process is long, involving extended service as acolytes to working inquisitors before the inquisitorial rosette is awarded. The people who make it through have, by the time they hold the rosette, already seen more than most imperial citizens will encounter in several lifetimes, and then the real work starts. The career of an active inquisitor involves a series of encounters with things that human psychology was not evolved to process. The standard advice from more experienced inquisitors to those newly rosette is some variation of the same theme. Develop a ritual, develop a framework, develop some way of categorizing what you see so that it doesn't just sit in your mind as raw, unprocessed horror. Give it structure. Make it information rather than experience. This advice is practically sound. It is also, over time, part of the mechanism by which inquisitors become something that other people find unsettling, even when they are doing nothing visibly alarming. The specific process is that the categories become more refined with experience, and the emotional response to filling those categories becomes more attenuated, or an inquisitor. Early in their career, confronting a Genestealer hybrid for the first time will feel something. The alien wrongness of it, the mixture of the familiar and the completely wrong, the fact that what they're looking at was once a human being and still has human features. This produces a visceral response that takes effort to push through. It takes training to maintain effective professional function while having that response. An inquisitor 20 years into their career, confronting the same thing, is less affected, not because they are less morally engaged with what they're seeing, but because the category is familiar. The cognitive processing that earlier required effort is now semi-automatic. The emotional response is there, in a quieter form, but it doesn't compete with the operational assessment in the same way. An inquisitor, 50 years in, 100 years in, inquisitors who use rejuvenate treatments to extend their operational careers significantly beyond a normal human lifespan is someone who has been doing this categorization for so long that the categories have become the primary way they see things. The world, as experienced by a century-old inquisitor, is substantially more sorted, substantially more processed, substantially more managed than the world as experienced by any ordinary person. This makes them extraordinarily effective at their job. It also makes them, to anyone who spends extended time in their presence, subtly and specifically frightening in a way that is different from the theatrical fear that the inquisitorial rosette itself produces. But the seasoned inquisitor is frightening not because of their authority, but because of what they demonstrate is possible, what a human being becomes when they have spent long enough looking at the worst things the galaxy produces and have not broken. The fear the Inquisition carries about its own personnel is partly this: that the process of becoming excellent at the job is also the process of becoming something that is less fully human in the ways that matter most for judgment, calls involving other humans. An inquisitor who has spent decades making calculations involving the sacrifice of some number of people for the greater safety of larger numbers of people becomes, over time, very efficient at those calculations. The machinery for making them is well-oiled by practice. But the numbers flow through the framework and produce outputs, and those outputs are acted on. What that inquisitor may have lost without noticing is the friction. The drag that a less experienced person still feels when the number at the bottom of the calculation is a very large one. The moment of genuine reluctance before giving the order that changes things irreversibly for the population of an entire world. That friction is not weakness. It is a signal. It is the part of human moral psychology that asks whether the framework is correct, even when the calculation inside the framework is running smoothly. Experienced inquisitors who have trained that friction away have also trained away their primary mechanism for catching the moments when the framework itself is wrong. This is why the Inquisition fears what extended service does to its most capable members, not because they lose their loyalty or their dedication, but because they may lose their ability to notice when the thing they are loyal and dedicated to has drifted from what it should be. Extended section. The world beyond the Ordo. Other threats. The Inquisition watches. The three major Ordos, Malleus, Hereticus, Xenos, are the most visible structures of the Inquisition's threat response framework. But the Inquisition maintains, alongside them, a collection of smaller Ordos Minoris, tasked with more specific or more unusual concerns. Some of these represent fears so particular that they require dedicated institutional attention. As the Ordo Sepulturum, the Order of the Tomb, was created to study and respond to the plague zombies produced by Nurgle's influence. The so-called zombie plague, which periodically erupts across infected worlds and turns populations into shambling vectors of further infection, is categorically different from simple chaos cult activity or standard demonic manifestation. It is biological. It spreads in ways that behave more like a disease than like a traditional chaos corruption. The Ordo Sepulturum's specific concern is identifying the zombie plague early enough to contain it, which requires a level of epidemiological sophistication that the standard Ordo frameworks don't provide. The Ordo Aegis existed specifically to defend the Cadian Gate, the region of space around Cadia and the Eye of Terror, from the specific and continuous threat emanating from that location. The fall of Cadia has substantially altered the mission parameters of whatever portion of the Ordo Aegis survived the catastrophe. The Ordo Redactus is perhaps the most internally controversial of the Ordos Minoris. Its mandate is the deliberate obscuring of imperial historical records, the removal, alteration, or sequestration of documents whose existence or content could, in the Ordo's assessment, lead to corruption or instability if widely known. The Ordo Redactus is, in essence, a professional falsification service operating within the Inquisition. This creates ongoing conflict with the Ordo Originatus, whose mandate is the opposite, the accurate reconstruction of imperial history as it actually happened, stripped of the layers of myth and political modification and deliberate redaction that 10,000 years have deposited on top of it. The two Ordos exist in permanent institutional tension, each undermining the other's work, each believing the other to be causing the more serious long-term harm to the Imperium. Robuta Guilliman's creation of the Logos Historica Verita, a core of trained historians explicitly charged with seeking historical truth and answering to the Primarch himself rather than to any inquisitorial authority, has substantially strengthened the Ordo Originatus's position and infuriated the Ordo Redactus, which now finds its redaction efforts complicated by a competing institutional power that has both resources and direct Primarch backing. The Inquisition's internal debate about the historical truth question maps onto the broader, radical Puritan dynamic. Puritans who align with the Ordo Redactus argue that the falsified, simplified, religiously framed history that most of the Imperium operates on is more psychically stable, produces less doubt, less questioning, less of the existential uncertainty that makes people vulnerable to chaos. Radicals who align with the Ordo Originatus argue that a population operating on false foundations is more fragile, not less, because when the falsifications become undeniable, as they inevitably do, as in contact with enough time and enough reality, the collapse of the false framework is catastrophic in ways that a framework built on accurate information would not be. Both arguments have merit. The Inquisition has been unable to resolve the tension for 10,000 years, and is not close to resolving it now. Extended section: The Silence Before the Storm. What the Inquisition has not yet found. One of the most anxiety-producing aspects of the Inquisition's mandate, for the individual inquisitors who think about it carefully, is the certainty that they do not know everything. This is not a generic statement about the limits of knowledge. It is a specific professional concern. The Inquisition is good at finding threats. They have had 10,000 years to develop the frameworks for recognition, the networks for intelligence gathering, as the analytical tools for pattern recognition in seemingly unrelated incidents that might together indicate something significant. They are, by any reasonable assessment, the most capable threat identification organization humanity has ever produced. And they know that they are not finding everything. The Genestila cult on Gossar Quintus was in operation for long enough that its discovery required an inquisitor to notice its absence from normal tracking, to notice that a region hadn't been heard from in suspicious ways, rather than being identified through proactive detection. The implication is clear. How many other infestations are proceeding similarly, in the space between inquisitorial visits, in regions where the density of agents is insufficient to catch the early signs. The Necron awakening was not something the Inquisition predicted or anticipated. The evidence was there in retrospect, but the picture was assembled after the fact. There was no moment where the Ordo Xenos correctly identified a pattern of evidence as early-stage Necron awakening and moved to address it before significant threats emerged. They found out about it by experiencing it, by encountering it, by being forced to recategorize a series of events they had previously attributed to other causes. What else exists that the Inquisition has not yet correctly categorized? What evidence is currently in their files attributed to known threat types that is actually the early signature of something that has not yet been identified as a distinct threat? Senior Inquisitors who allow themselves to think about this at length do not sleep easily. Because the logic is sound, the galaxy is large. The Inquisition's reach, however impressive, is finite. The things that want to harm humanity are numerous, and some of them are old enough and patient enough to have developed very effective methods of not being noticed until they are ready to act. The Inquisition is doing its best. It is doing extraordinary work, accomplished by extraordinary people under impossible conditions. And it knows, with the specific clarity that comes from long experience, in a field where the unknown risks are real, that its best is probably not enough to catch everything. The question is what it misses. The question is what's already in motion, already developing, already approaching a threshold, in the spaces between their attention, in the worlds they haven't visited recently. Yet in the patterns, their frameworks aren't designed to recognize. The Inquisition doesn't know, and not knowing in this context is genuinely and specifically frightening in ways that no particular known threat is, because at least known threats can be fought directly. The unknown threat is only frightening, until suddenly, without warning, it becomes something much worse. Extended section. Grey Knights. The secret within the secret. There is one institution connected to the Inquisition that is itself one of the most heavily classified facts in the entire Imperium. So classified that for much of the Imperium's history, most Space Marine chapters did not know they existed. So classified that their mere existence represented a security concern serious enough that inquisitorial policy mandated the memory modification of Space Marine Astartes, who came into contact with them. Some of the most resilient and psychically fortified warriors humanity has ever produced, as a matter of standard protocol. The Grey Knights. The Grey Knights are a Space Marine chapter in the technical sense. They are organized along similar lines. They are Space Marines in their biology. They wear power armor and wield weapons. But they differ from any other chapter in the Imperium in ways that make those similarities almost incidental. Every Grey Knight is a psyker, not a chapter that includes psykers among its ranks, as librarians, in the way every other Adeptus Astartes chapter does. Every single battle brother, from the newest initiate to the most senior Grandmaster, possesses psychic ability. They were selected for it. Their entire training and development program is built around the dual requirement of being an exceptional physical warrior and an exceptional psychic practitioner simultaneously. Their weapons are psychically attuned. The Nemesis Force. Weapons they wield are not simply power weapons with an aesthetic affinity for the supernatural. They are tools designed to harm demons in ways that conventional weapons cannot. Channels for the psychic power of the Grey Knight wielding them, capable of disrupting the warp binding that keeps a demon in real space, in a way that pure physical force cannot easily accomplish. Their armor is inscribed inside and out with prayers and seals and bindings of extraordinary depth, while the process of inscribing it is itself a psychic working, performed by master craftsmen over extended periods. The protection this provides against demonic influence is measurable and significant. A Grey Knight squad operating in a demonic incursion environment experiences the reality distortion and sanity pressure of that environment far more manageably than any equivalent conventional force would. They are, in short, the specific answer to a specific question. If you had to build a warrior from the ground up specifically to fight demons as effectively as possible, this is what you would build. The classification around their existence is maintained partly for the practical reason that chaos entities, and particularly Tzeentchian entities, whose specialty is acquiring and exploiting information, would find the knowledge of Grey Knight capabilities operationally useful for developing effective countermeasures. But it is also maintained because the Grey Knights represent, at an institutional level, an acknowledgement of a secret that the Inquisition generally tries to keep quiet. The Imperium needs them. There are threats that the standard military response cannot handle. There are incursions that require something the Astra Militarum, however brave and however numerous, cannot provide. The need for the Grey Knights is evidence that the Ordo Malleus's threats are, at their worst extreme, beyond the conventional military capacity of the largest human civilization the galaxy has ever produced. The Inquisition's fear about the Grey Knights is not about the Grey Knights themselves, who are extraordinarily reliable. The fear is about what their necessity implies, about the gap between the threat level at the top of the Ordo Malleus's case files and the tools available to respond to those threats, about the moments, documented, classified, when even the Grey Knights were not enough and the situation required something different and uglier and far more costly. There are records of demonic incursions that the Grey Knights contained. There are also records of incursions that were not fully contained, that required exterminatus to stop further spread, and those records contain the specific notation that the Grey Knights were present and functioned as intended, and it still required destroying the world to close the case. Thus, those records exist. The Inquisitors who read them have to then go and do the next thing. Extended section: the weight of exterminatus and what it does to the person who orders it. An Inquisitor who orders exterminatus is making the largest decision available to any individual human being in the Imperium. They are condemning a world and every living thing on it to absolute destruction. The specific methods vary: virus bombs that liquefy all organic matter, atmospheric incinerators that turn a world's air into fire, cyclonic torpedoes that crack the planet's mantle and release the geological forces of a dying world. But the outcome is the same. Nothing survives. Everything that existed on that world, from the smallest organism to the largest city, from the most corrupt heretic to the most innocent child, ceases to exist. The formal authority to do this is held by Inquisitors and by certain senior Space Marine officers. Within that authority, the practical and moral decision to actually use it rests entirely on the judgment of one person. There is no committee review. There is no higher authority to appeal to. The Inquisitor present, in the moment, with the information available to them, makes the call and lives with it afterward. The Inquisition's position on this is sometimes misrepresented as casual or bloodthirsty. The image of an Inquisitor pressing a button that destroys a world with no emotional engagement, treating it as a routine administrative function. This is not what the law describes, and it is not what the psychology supports. Most Inquisitors who order exterminatus grieve. In private, after the fact, in whatever space they have to be, something other than the public face of absolute imperial authority. The grief is real. The weight is real. The knowledge that billions of people who were innocent of whatever necessitated the order, innocent of the chaos cult that had grown too large to purge through conventional means, innocent of the Genestealer infestation that had compromised the planetary defense force, innocent of the demonic incursion that had taken sufficient hold that containing it required destroying the container, died because of a decision they made is not something that most Inquisitors experience as neutral or easy. What they do with that weight varies. Yet some develop psychological techniques for compartmentalization, the ability to maintain functional separation between the decision-making professional mode and the private mode, where the grief is allowed to exist. Some develop faith-based frameworks that situate the decision in a theological context large enough to carry it. Some process it by writing, private journals that will never be read by anyone, records of the thinking behind each decision, attempts to ensure that the reasoning is sound and that they haven't simply become someone who finds it easy. And some of them, over the course of very long careers, stop grieving, not through a deliberate decision to stop, but through the gradual exhaustion of that capacity under the accumulated weight of too many such decisions made too frequently across too many years. But when an inquisitor stops grieving, exterminatus orders, they have changed in a way that concerns their colleagues. Not because their decisions necessarily become worse. They may remain just as analytically sound, just as carefully considered, just as genuinely oriented toward the least harm outcome. But because the absence of grief represents the loss of a signal. The friction we discussed earlier, the psychic drag that asks whether the framework is correct, is partly sustained by the emotional weight that comes with making decisions inside the framework. When that weight disappears, the signal disappears with it. The Inquisition has no formal mechanism for identifying when this transition has occurred in a colleague, and no agreed-upon response when it does. While it is one of many areas where the institutional design is inadequate to the actual demands of the job, and has been inadequate for as long as the job has existed, some things do not have institutional solutions. They only have people doing their best for as long as they can in conditions that routinely exceed what they were built to handle. Extended section, a map of broken light, the Great Rift and the world. After Cadia. It is difficult to overstate what the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum means for the Inquisition's operational reality. Before the Great Rift, the Imperium was under pressure from all sides, but that pressure was distributed. The threats were geographically and temporally spread across 1 million worlds and 10,000 years of documented history. The Inquisition could respond to them, not perfectly, never perfectly, but responsively. A crisis in one sector did not automatically make every other crisis worse. The infrastructure of communication and travel that connected Imperial space, for all its vulnerability, mostly functioned. The Great Rift changed the fundamental operating environment. The galaxy is cut in two. The portion containing Terra and the Astronomicon, called Sanctus, the Sacred Imperium, and the portion on the other side of the rift, called Nihilus, the Imperium of Night, are not fully isolated from each other, but the barrier between them is permeable only intermittently and at great difficulty. Messages cross. Some travel is possible, but the reliable, regular communication that the Imperium's administrative architecture depends on does not function in the same way. The Imperium of Night, the portion of Imperial space on the far side of the rift from Terra, is in a condition that even the Inquisition's most experienced assessors find difficult to fully characterize. The warp in that region is actively hostile in a way that exceeds the general baseline hostility the warp has had since the Horus Heresy. Ships attempting to travel through it are lost at dramatically higher rates. Worlds that were receiving regular black ship visits are now not, because the black ships cannot reliably reach them. Psyker populations on those worlds are growing without management. Chaos cult activity in regions cut off from inquisitorial reach is presumably increasing, though intelligence from those regions is, by definition, difficult to obtain. The Inquisition's chapters and conclaves on the nihilist side of the rift are operating with dramatically reduced support from central resources and dramatically reduced ability to coordinate with each other. They are, effectively, each doing their best in isolation, making decisions without the information networks and consultation structures that standard inquisitorial practice depends on. Some of them are making those decisions very well, because they were selected and trained for extreme autonomy. Some of them are, presumably, making them less well, and the Inquisition won't know which until the rift's conditions change enough to allow better communication. On the Sanctus side, the situation is somewhat better. The Astronomicon still reaches. Imperial command still functions with its characteristic dysfunction. The flow of information and resources hasn't entirely broken down, but the rift's proximity affects warp conditions even here. The frequency of demonic incursions has increased. The rate of warp storms has increased. The general turbulence of the Imperium has made travel slower and more dangerous, which has knock-on effects for every supply chain and military deployment in the portion of the Imperium it touches. Reboot Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade. The military campaign launched from Terra immediately after the Great Rift's opening, prosecuted at extraordinary scale and pace across both sides of the rift, has provided relief where it has reached. The Primaris Space Marines reinforcing depleted chapters, the direct engagement with the most severe chaos and tyrannid threats in the Crusade's path, and the political pressure from the Lord Commander himself, forcing institutional reform and mobilization in ways that the Inquisition alone could not. All of this has genuine value. The Inquisition's assessment of Guilliman's crusade is mixed, which says something about the Inquisition's relationship with good news. They recognize the military and political achievements. They are concerned about the pace of institutional change he is driving, about the exposure of certain classified information to wider audiences than the Inquisition considers safe, about the religious and philosophical implications of a Primarch operating in the galaxy again after 10,000 years of the Emperor's absent divinity being the foundation of the Imperial Creed. They are also, in their more honest internal moments, aware that without the Crusade and without Guilliman, the situation would be measurably worse. The Inquisition is not equipped to face the aftermath of the Great Rift alone. They may not be willing to say this publicly. The private assessment is somewhat different. Final section. Everything that was not said. There are things on the Inquisition's threat register that we haven't discussed today. Not because they are unimportant, but because the list of what the Inquisition watches and worries about is effectively unlimited. It encompasses everything that could harm humanity, or the Imperium, or the long-term survival of consciousness in this galaxy, and that is a very large category with very many entries. The Aeldari and their relationship to the Inquisition's work deserves its own exploration. A species of immense psychic power, a far older and in many ways far more knowledgeable than humanity about the nature of the warp and the chaos gods, who are simultaneously potential allies against shared threats and potential threats in themselves, whose goals for the galaxy align with humanity's only partially, and who are ruthlessly willing to sacrifice human life when they calculate it serves their purposes. The Inquisition's relationship with the various branches of Aeldari society is one of the most operationally complex in the Ordo Xenos' entire portfolio. The Toe and their psychic silence, the fact that the Toe have no warp presence of note, that they do not produce the psychic resonance that other species do, that their rapid expansion represents a fundamentally different kind of civilization emerging in the galaxy, presents questions that the Ordo Xenos is still formulating frameworks to address. The Orcs, whose species-level psychic field, the collective belief that drives their technology to function in ways that shouldn't be physically possible, represents a form of reality manipulation that the Inquisition finds deeply uncomfortable to explain fully within any standard framework. The scale of an Orc war, at its largest, has been sufficient to threaten entire sectors, and the Orc response to adversity is not death, but escalation. Defeat makes them angrier and more motivated, which is not a quality that most enemies share. The Men of Iron, the ancient artificial intelligences whose rebellion during the dark age of technology nearly destroyed humanity long before the Horus heresy, who may or may not still exist in various forms in the most isolated and long-forgotten corners of the galaxy, whose very concept is so horrifying to the Adeptus Mechanicus that their prohibition on true artificial intelligence is among the most absolute in Imperial law. The Enslavers, the Lacrimole, the Silently Screaming, entities that appear in historical records, but whose current status and prevalence are unclear, whose documented capabilities are significant enough to warrant monitoring, whose absence from current threat registries might represent genuine dormancy or might represent gaps in the detection framework, the warp in general, which we discussed at length, but which contains more than what we covered. the fundamental instability of the Imperium, the possibility that the barrier between the warp and real space, weakened by thousands of years of war and by the events of the Great Rift's opening, might be approaching a threshold beyond which it becomes permanently compromised. The possibility that the Eldar's worst-case scenario, the complete merging of real space and warp space, the galaxy drowned in chaos, every living being exposed to the full, unmediated presence of entities that evolve to feed on them, might be a trajectory rather than a theoretical worst case. The Inquisition knows about all of this, carries all of it, goes to the next assignment carrying all of it, alongside every decision made on the previous one, goes alongside every world burned and mind-wiped and population scattered, alongside every colleague whose loss is another weight in the ongoing accumulation. They are human beings, or were once, or still are in the ways that matter. They carry all of this, and they keep moving, because the candle doesn't light itself. And in the dark of the 41st millennium, nothing survives long without light.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.